Hi, this is Tony Northrup for TrainSignal, and in this video lesson I'm going to cover Internetwork trust architectures for the SSCP certification exam. First, I'd like to talk about delegating management rights within a single organization. So let's imagine TrainSignal.com, and TrainSignal is not that large of a company, but let's imagine that they're an enterprise with multiple different offices and thousands of different employees. At some point, you have to start delegating privileges, right? Like if you work for a small organization with 30 people, you can have a single IT guy, and that IT guy can handle all of the account creation, resetting every single password, making sure that each user has the correct rights to any resources that they need to access. But once you get to a few thousand people, one person's not going to cut it anymore. So there are different ways that companies delegate authority over managing resources and users, and this particular example shows geographic delegation. TrainSignal in this example has offices throughout the country, and they've decided to allow local IT staff to handle the resources that are in that particular local office. That's a popular way to do it. Sometimes it's more organizational. Sometimes in a really large company, the accounting department will have their own few IT people who deal with just accounting issues, and you'd organize it as accounting and then IT in that way. Sometimes it's entirely centralized and there's just one big IT department that deals with everything. Once you get really big like this, you need to start breaking down the organization into smaller parts, and lots of different software implementations allow you to do that. For example, the Microsoft Active Directory, which is LDAP and Kerberos based, allows you to create different domains and then set up trust architectures between the domains. So in this particular diagram, you could think of each of these triangles as a different domain, and each of the different lines between them to be a trust. So the top level, TrainSignal.com, probably wouldn't have any employees in it. Instead, this would be there purely for architectural reasons, to link together all of the different locations. Now, these lines of trust allow users in the west domain to access resources in the east domain. So a user over here could share a folder on a file server located in the east domain and then assign privileges to a user in the west domain. This is allowed because there are lines of trust, and of course for the SSCP certification exam, you're not going to have to know how to implement that because it's not implementation level, it's conceptual level. So in this particular example, it's various Kerberos domains of trust. At the implementation level, it could, for example, be Microsoft Active Directory. Now, what happens when you need to share resources with somebody outside the organization? Well, it gets a lot more complex. Often you need to share files or resources with partners, suppliers, customers, contractors, and often software-based web services. So how do you do this? Well, I think the most common way in practice is just email. If you need to share a file with somebody, you just stick it in an email and send it off. But that's a really scary thing to a security guy because you've just given up complete control over that document. Once you email it off, there's another copy that has no access control list attached to it. There's no way to audit it. You can't tell who's looking at it. You don't know if it's been copied to the public internet or if they're taking good care of it. So sending an email is not a great way to share things unless it's considered completely open and public. Regardless, it's still a really common way to provide access to internal resources to external users. But there are some better ways. Federated access at a conceptual level is simply trusting an outside authentication service. And in practice, you've probably worked with several of these already. Facebook Connect is pretty pervasive on the web today. You can log into hundreds of different websites, and maybe you're just making a comment on a blog, or maybe you're actually logging into an account which contains confidential information. But whenever you see that little login with Facebook button, well, that's using Facebook Connect, and that's using an example of federated access at the consumer level. Microsoft accounts do this too. With Windows 8, you can log onto your computer with a Microsoft account, which used to be called a Windows Live account. And if you log on to a different Windows computer, well, it'll synchronize all of your stuff for you. It'll also use that same account to authenticate to different services within your apps. So if you open up the weather app, well, it can identify you uniquely. So the weather app knows your home location and other towns where you want to track the weather. In enterprise environments, one of the most common ways of doing this is by establishing an Active Directory trust between a couple of different groups, and we'll go more in detail about that later. So Facebook Connect is a good way for a website to allow any random consumer to log onto it using federated access. But what if you're talking about confidential resources and you're not talking about consumers, but you're talking about a partner? Well, this actually happened to me personally with TrainSignal. TrainSignal, of course, has content management systems where I upload the outlines and the PowerPoint slides and the videos that I record, and they needed to provide me access to it. So imagine that's me over there in the contoso.com triangle with an account that has no relationship whatsoever to trainsignal.com. Here's how TrainSignal handled it, and this is what most organizations do. They created a new account for me in their own domain. And that works fine. They have complete control over this new account. They probably set an expiration on the account so my account wouldn't be valid forever. Of course, they followed the principle of least privilege and only granted me access to the very few resources that I needed for my specific project. But this particular method came with some costs. Well, for one, it was a bit of a pain to me because I had to learn a new username and a new password. I have yet another account that I have to manage. It means I have to think a little bit about how they manage accounts and passwords because I don't know if their systems are secure. It could be that when I type my password in there that password's being recorded in plain text and somebody could get it, which could have greater implications for me as an individual. So by creating a duplicate account, you're adding a lot of management for both the hosting company and the individual user, and it's kind of a lot of work. Here's another method that's common when organizations are hiring, say, a partnering company and they're going to be working with many different users at the group. Imagine that Contoso.com is a consulting firm that's providing services to TrainSignal, and they're going to have their whole team in there accessing hundreds of different files on different servers. TrainSignal.com could take the route of simply creating duplicate user accounts for everybody in their own domain. All those users have to memorize a new password and synchronize it and learn all the new websites to access, and that could be really difficult. A better way to do it would be to create a trust. TrainSignal.com could trust Contoso.com to authenticate users on its behalf. That sounds pretty scary, right? Because TrainSignal.com is going to be sending requests to Contoso.com saying, hey, this user is trying to access a resource. Is this their valid password? Can you verify that they really are who they identified themselves to be? And Contoso.com can come back with the answer, and TrainSignal.com doesn't ever need to know their passwords or whether the user account is expired. They're delegating complete control over authentication to the partnering domain. But it's not that scary because as you remember the difference between authentication and authorization, authentication just proves who you are. It doesn't actually get you access to any resources. So trust like this delegates authentication, but it keeps authorization within the TrainSignal.com domain. So after they set up the trust, users from Contoso.com could authenticate and then get nowhere. So it is a first step, and you wouldn't want to go establishing trust to companies that you didn't have any relationship with. You'd open yourself up to a little bit of a security risk. But at the same time, you have to manually provide authorization for the Contoso.com users to any resources that they're going to access. So if there's a file server in the West domain over here, you'd have to go onto that file server and edit the access control list and say the accounting team from Contoso.com can edit the files in this folder. And then once a user actually authenticated from Contoso.com and they access that specific resource, well, they'd be able to get access to it. But until you created that access control list, even the authenticated users from the trusted domain wouldn't be able to access anything. So it does mitigate your risk some. Even though it sure sounds scary, it's not as bad as it is. Let's talk about mergers and acquisitions. This is pretty big business and it's a real bother. Sometimes really big companies buy each other and suddenly all the different users want to be able to access all the different resources. So again, You could take all the users in Contoso.com and create duplicate accounts for them in TrainSignal.com. All the users would have to learn new passwords and learn perhaps new usernames, get new email addresses and such. And frankly, that's what a lot of companies do, especially if they have incompatible systems. But if the two organizations do have compatible systems, if it's technically feasible for them to establish a trust, well, you can do that. And then administrators could assign Contoso.com users access to resources within TrainSignal.com. And because it's bidirectional, Contoso.com could share resources with TrainSignal.com users. Anytime a request on a Contoso.com resource came in to authenticate a TrainSignal.com user, well, that authentication request would be sent across the trust to the TrainSignal.com domain, which would give a thumbs up or a thumbs down on whether that user could be authenticated. And then, of course, if it's authenticated, the domain that hosts the resources would be able to determine whether or not the user was authorized. This is Tony Northrup for TrainSignal, and thanks so much for watching this video lesson.